Right. Well, thank you all for joining us on this Tuesday lunchtime. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from today, the Darug people. I'm fortunate enough to work on this land, to live on this land, and to have actually been raised on this land. So I'd really like to acknowledge their enduring custodianship. I'd also like to pay respect to elders past and present and extend that respect to the custodians of the lands that you're joining us from today, and also to welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here on this webinar. This is our fourth webinar in the ACGR webinar series for 2025, and we're very fortunate today to have Professor Peter Anderson, who is the Pro Vice Chancellor Indigenous at the University of New England, to talk about supporting Indigenous success through quality supervision in research degrees. Professor Anderson is a Walpiri and Murrumbidgee people from the Willowpiri and Murrumbidgee peoples of the Northern Territory, and his research spans areas of Australian Indigenous education, education systems, curriculum, and pedagogical interventions, as well as the intersecting relationships with Indigenous peoples both globally and domestically. Professor Anderson is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy UK, a Fellow of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Science, and a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and a lifelong Fellow of the Atlantic Institute at Oxford University. He also holds research advisory positions for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, the Diversity Council of Australia, and the Australian Education Research Association. Also close to home here at ACGR, Professor Anderson was one of the architects of our good practice guidelines for supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research education, and is part of a working group for ACGR that is currently redeveloping or reviewing and updating those guidelines, which we'll be looking forward to sharing with the sector in due course. So as not to take up too much time, I'll now hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Tracy, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's really good to have a conversation. So what I thought I'm going to do today is I'm going to run through a bit of a presentation, but what I've tried to do is really link it back to our book that we've developed on supporting Indigenous HDR students for success, which was a few years ago. Unfortunately, we were gazumped by COVID at the release, so it didn't quite get out there in that stage. So I'm always panhandling my stuff everywhere. So please enjoy, and it's free to download. You can download it by chapter. And I've tried to link various aspects of the presentation to specific aspects in the book for you. One of the things I'd like to preface my talk on today is that really you as supervisors have these skills already. And so I'm not probably going to present anything new. Often, our policies and procedures seem to denote that there's this different set of processes for Indigenous HDR students, etc. But I think hopefully this will reiterate some of the skills that you have and give you a little bit more confidence in the space. I'm going to go through for probably about 45 minutes. I've asked Tracy to flag at about 22, because I think there might be some questions and really to have a conversation around this, given that it's a priority across our sector, but it's really, where do we start with this as supervisors and as deans of research? And so please type your questions into the chat, and hopefully I can get to them in due course. And also feel free to drop me an email too at the end if I don't get to it. So without further ado, I would like to acknowledge the land of the Anawan people here in Armidale, in which I'm lucky enough to be in my 4th week here at the University of New England. and also paying respects to the Gambanya, the Milleroi and Dungari nations, in which we have a footprint as well, across Tamworth,
Do
Taree.
you know how many are joining?
Okay. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is supporting Indigenous success through quality supervision, and thinking about what is it that we have at our fingertips to start doing some of this work. And hopefully I will get you to start thinking about your own supervisor training, thinking about your own practice, how you can step further into your practice and dig in. So the current landscape of Indigenous HDRs in Australia is that whilst our enrolments have increased, the completion rates are fairly steady to low. Sometimes some of this is also to do with the research infrastructure, that, as you know, we sit within a broader set of sort of policies and procedures in terms of our work. And it's worthwhile thinking about and possibly making notes of what are some of the blocks internally or the systems that may sort of hinder or may promote success within your institution. I certainly know from our research is that ethics and leading up to ethics is one of the big issues for Indigenous students, and coming to the ethics process. So one of the things that I certainly do with my students who are Indigenous, or even non-Indigenous students working in Indigenous contexts, is to actually prepare them that, you know, the form is going to turn red, don't worry, it will come back to you, but we have a contingency plan in terms of how to address this. There's Indigenous students, they get to ethics and think, you know, it is quite disempowering that suddenly you're high risk. I certainly knew from my research when I was doing my PhD, I was working with senior Indigenous academics, and there were only 4 in my sample group out of probably 40. But because I identified as Indigenous, they went to high risk. And these are very senior Indigenous academics. And I was like, oh, if I was actually do any harm, they'd probably harm me and I won't have a career. But my supervisor had a contingency plan in terms of how to respond to that. So that's something to think about it. I also think that this really matters in terms of how we thinking about Indigenous knowledges in the academy. So Universities Australia constantly says there needs to be Indigenous knowledges, the science priorities, etc., the ARC. And thinking also about how are we engaging with Indigenous experts such as PhD students and early career academics to answer these big problems. I mean, the gap, for example, is not getting closed. And you know, I always think just of myself in my travels in my institutions is that I'm in these brain banks and yet we can't actually mobilize ourselves to actually be engaged in these big projects because there's a level of agency that we're not empowering people to do this. I mean, and also thinking that there's probably less than 800 academics nationally. So as a collective, I think we need to think about, you know, there's 800 academics, give or take 10% over under, I always go with, level A to E. So we don't know where people sit within that, that sort of academic scale. So we also have an issue around our workforce in terms of if we're getting more Indigenous students in, how are we actually identifying suitable assessors? One of the challenges that I have is around my discipline of education is actually quite small, and I tend to write with a lot of my colleagues, so then they can't assess any of my students. And so I have you know, as supervisors, we often have our cache of people that we can go to that we trust will engage with the students' work in a way that I would say also decently. Knowing that the PhD is a novice sort of piece of work. I mean, you know, I say to my students, my PhD is actually a monitor holder. that reminds me, and so it sort of shifts from being your life's work to something functional, like holding up your computer screen, in my case. But I also think it's actually around creating educational equity. It's actually, and I've got here achieving equity and social justice, but I think also it's around creating a pathway to rights and intellectual rights and rights of Indigenous peoples. And so what do rights mean in terms of our roles as supervisors and our roles as supervisors of Indigenous students, but also supervising and encouraging non-Indigenous students to actually be able to engage in Indigenous research in a way that is based in protocols, that does no harm, etc. So that's one of the areas that I'm quite keen on exploring in my own work. I've only had a few Indigenous students that I've supervised because most Indigenous teachers are so traumatized from the workforce that they don't want to come back into the discipline. So we have to, I always say, build it and they will come. So if I'm supervising good non-Indigenous students who become academics, they then will create a space where Indigenous students may want to come in. Okay, so that's just something to think about as well. So some of the common barriers for Indigenous students, and this is drawn specifically from our research, also the research by Aileen Morton-Robinson that was commissioned by the Department of Education. So we try to really anchor it in some facts. So we've got the first barrier is academic and research skills gap. So many of our students, we know that enrolment data would say that they are mature age students who are transitioning from, workplaces, etc., through different pathways. And so sometimes there's, with all mature age students, there's that gap of how we're actually scaffolding them into the life of being a PhD student and all of those skills. What I've found with students is actually really getting them engaged with learning skills that are through the library or whatever your institution has in terms of building that support. One of the big things is around supervisor relationships and issues. Sometimes there's an immobilization of, that I've found with non-Indigenous supervisors that don't feel like they can engage with, I don't know, there's a sort of a gap that they don't want to offend, etc., in terms of engaging with Indigenous PhD students. Sometimes it's a really interesting dynamic to see, and we found that in the data that Indigenous students were saying that they can feel sometimes when the supervisor is actually just being nice. And, as supervisors, we're generally in our own discipline, we're actually quite experts. And so we should be able to engage in those sorts of conversations with our students. Lack of academic support. And this is sometimes really, and we think about this at the first and family kind of conversations. Whilst there is a lack of Indigenous staff in many universities, as I've already said, I'm thinking about, in my roles, I've always employed somebody which we called Indigenous postgraduate support officers in my specific areas. That was somebody who was specifically employed to be a central point of contact between, say, the graduate school, but also between schools and faculties or groups or divisions that are doing the enrolling. So I've always had one person who then had a counterpart at the faculty or the group or school in terms of enrolling students. It's also for a community engagement kind of role where the community actually have one point of contact. And I say community when I'm actually thinking about prospective students. There's one person they can contact who then can sort of be a conduit between a specific area. My area used to be the Indigenous Research Unit at both Griffith, QUT, and also at Deakin, but now also I don't have that role, but the graduate school here at UNE will be working in those sorts of spaces. That a student does not get lost in the sort of administrivia of our systems. And thinking about also and taking into consideration the holistic challenges often of all students, and particularly Indigenous students. Our Indigenous HDR cohort are generally mature aged. They have children, they have, all of these different things. They're very senior in their professions, etc. So sometimes we have to think about that. Often it's just having that conversation, and the student might say, oh, I'm actually fine. I've been released from work 1 day a week, and I'm here on campus to do this. I don't really need to engage with all of the Indigenous goings on campus. I'm here for a short time, not a good time. I've done that at my undergraduate level. And so I'm just very focused on getting this done. And I think sometimes also, and I put in here, and it's not part of this research, but it's something I'm looking at further, is around the holistic challenges. Is internally there's this push and pull in terms of the destination of where the student's going to end up. The pipeline so far is only into academia. So it's thinking about, like in the professions, how are we actually into consideration with the student? Like they may want to go back to industry. In my case, in education, they may just want to stay in schools, but have a higher qualification and expertise in a certain space. So there's those considerations to think about, I think, which are really important. So thinking about some of the myths, and we get caught up in some of the myths, really, and this is really pulled from what Indigenous students were saying. Myth 1 is that Indigenous HDR students need an Indigenous supervisor. I have been asked to supervise a student in electrical engineering, and when I dug deeper, I said, like, why? It turned out that they were Indigenous, and I was like, what is it that I bring to the table in an engineering sense? So that's always a really interesting kind of conversation. And often if you're in your institution, you have these conversations with some of your senior Indigenous colleagues, I'm like, what are you doing? So there's that sort of, I tend to have a really strange sort of face that I sort of pull it because I'm, what? Oh, I don't understand. Myth 2 is that Indigenous HDR students must use Indigenous research methods. This is an absolute furphy. Just because you're Indigenous, as we all know, just looking around the room, there are, hundreds of different methods and methodologies just amongst us in terms of what we do. There's not one Indigenous method that actually suits, every Indigenous context, and throwing out keywords so people will know, who know me, who work with me, throwing out keywords like yarning to me is like a bit of a red bull, which a flag to a red flag to a bull, because then I will interrogate you for actually asking me why you're saying you want to do yarning. And I will say, what's the difference between yarning and open-ended questions and or case studies and or? So, you're sort of really unpacking that. And so this is part of the engagement with the student. Sometimes it is appropriate with students to have a methodology, an Indigenous method, but also then it's navigating the student to the complexity of that and really locating it and making the conversation in chapter 3 of the thesis that actually, why am I using the Indigenous method, and getting students to actually be able to talk back to the canon of knowledge to actually justify rather than just plonking. And so that's the skill as an Indigenous academic that I'm constantly having to do. And so if I could have learned, because I didn't do an Indigenous method, I'd done a very boring sort of grounded theory PhD based on data, and I looked at commercialization. So, like very far removed from where I've sort of ended up. But I think having those skills, because, even the ARC is constantly saying, well, it should be an Indigenous method. I'm like, well, sorry, Jan, but how do you know that? So you know what I mean? So there's this nuance, and I absolutely think that Indigenous research methods needs to be in the curriculum of our institutions. I mean, I actually know about feminist method. I actually know about Asia's method. I actually know about all these different methods, yet my colleagues do not know about Indigenous research methods. That is a glaring omission in our research training in all of our institutions, and it's an indictment on all of us to actually not have it there. It's a bolt on, and that's my I'm pushing that sort of agenda today. Is that why is it not there? You know, why is it always in the too hard basket? I can't do it. As I said, I understand the fundamentals of feminist research method, and I know how to navigate that. And I'm not asking people to be experts, but it's actually having that, you know, toolkit of different methods and being able to navigate through that. And also Indigenous students should research Indigenous issues. I mean, you know, that I think is quite difficult. Sometimes our funding is tied to that, or scholarships that automatically, you know, as an Indigenous student, it's like, well, why aren't you doing this? Or why aren't you doing that? And so it precludes, you know, excludes a lot of people. So thinking about those, and this is a way in which we can alleviate some of those barriers in terms of it's an Indigenous person just wanting to study, you know, okay, and that's fine. Okay, in terms of what Indigenous HDR students need in quality supervision, you know, I sometimes, you know, when I found the research and we found the findings and I was really going over it again, I was like, it's just really good supervision at the end of the day. It's good supervision practice. You know, there's clear expectations, you know, and each student, as you know, is different in terms of communications and working styles, and there are boundaries. You know, like time and commitment in terms of engaging with students and feedback. There's respectful relationships, and this is on the part of the student as well. You know, I have had Indigenous students who've actually been quite forceful with supervisors, and, you know, and I've had to remind students, we have a code of conduct, that this is not how, you know, you engage in that sort of space. So I think, and that is part of the sort of open and transparent process in terms of, you know, really setting the groundwork. I always say to my students, and this is Indigenous and non-Indigenous, if I'm not the right fit, feel free and we can work to get you someone who will actually fit better for you. You know, and just being really upfront with that, we found in the data that Indigenous students actually didn't know that they could change supervisors, and sometimes they just really stuck it out. And, you know, thinking about it in my career, I had a great supervisor. So, you know, sometimes it's, you know, and I look back and my PhD was the best time ever. You know, I could just focus on my research and, you know, not trying to attract money and do publications and things like that. So it should be enjoyable. So how do we sort of capture that little bit of joy for them? And the biggest thing that I keep coming back to is expertise. That Indigenous students come to institutions and to supervisors for their expertise, rather than, you know, very quickly, this supervisor is nice to the Aborigines, or, you know, they've done cross-cultural awareness training, or they've done, you know, the anti-bias, and you can list them all off. It's like, well, I'm actually a good supervisor because I can engage with the student intellectually and, you know, be able to transition them through their study, you know, like in that very beginning stage before confirmation, where it's a bit of a subject, you know, where you're actually the lead, but then once they get data collection, they're actually leading you then, and you're helping to shape that, those data and the PhD findings, etc. So I think that's also about part of the supervisor relationship with the student, and saying, this is what I do in the beginning, but this is how then I'll work with you towards the end. And it's really around the expertise of the supervisor in the discipline area, you know, and sort of not really, you know, hiding behind the codes, or this is an Indigenous code, blah, but it's actually, who are you and what do you actually bring and what's your expertise in this space, I think. And so this is me sort of speaking back to you that you actually have a lot of these tools within your sort of toolkit already. So how do you dip back into it? So one of the other things we found is fostering agency and academic capital. And it's really, as you know, academia is a game. And particularly with Indigenous students, they're often the first in the discipline or the second or third. So there's lots of pulling on their time or being involved in different things. And so it's really, you know, like one of the very valuable conversations I had with my supervisor was actually unpacking what the different metrics are around publishing. And because Indigenous students, we're often asked to co-author things and different bits and pieces. And so knowing, you know, if I do an A-star journal or, you know, what these actually mean, and rather than, you know, saying, I'm just going to collaborate on this, then suddenly you've actually unwittingly published part of your, you know, PhD, and so you can't use that. So there's these different things that you're often not taught, but this is something I think as a whole in terms of academia, it's you have to be in the know. And really, you know, supporting students. So often in my roles as Director of Indigenous Research and having an Indigenous Research unit, students still came over to our space just to decompress and to actually have a little bit of anonymity, that, you know, they're not the Indigenous PhD student, they're not the first, they're not this, you know what I mean? There's so many firsts, there's so many they are. And also, you know, a lot of the disciplines are steeped in racism. And when you have a novice scholar actually speaking back truth to power, that can often put off people. And so it becomes an unsafe environment. So as supervisors, how are we navigating that within our role? Are these issues that we bring up to the Dean of Graduate Research, etc.? So navigating those sorts of fields. And also, this is a big one for me. It's not cultural safety. It's actually naming racism and addressing racism. You know, it's sometimes in Australia, it gets clumped under this cultural safety stuff and we don't know, but cultural safety is quite different to racism. And as Aboriginal people, we learn very early on in life that if we report, nothing really happens. And it's our problem for calling it out. You know, and I heard a quote the other day, and it's like, you know, white privilege is living in a world where racism doesn't exist because it's just in your little bubble, you know, whereas as Indigenous people within the academy, we are raced. Sometimes it's not safe. And so how are we as supervisors helping navigating those and having those tough conversations with our colleagues and the systems? I think, and so that's something that we take on as well, and which is also the navigating of the challenges. So I've covered a bit more of that in chapters 4 of the book. But I think really it's tying back, and as Indigenous people, if we actually understand that it is racially safe, you can actually thrive because you don't have to be second guessing. You don't feel like you're being gaslit. You don't feel like, you know, it's like, oh, okay, did that really happen? And sort of understanding there are many different levels of racism in terms of how we navigate these spaces, I think. And as people who don't experience racism, I think you actually have to recognize that it exists. So the University of Technology, Sydney has a report called Gariyala in the business school, led by Professor Noreen Young. I think it was 98% of Indigenous people in the workplace have come up against racism and racist conversations and racist beliefs. So it does exist. Yet when you're the raced, often it doesn't move forward because it then becomes a personal issue, okay? That you're constantly raising it. And so it's like reliving trauma because racism is traumatic. So I think that's a conversation that is really central to success. It's an occupational health and safety issue. For many of us in some states, it's psychosocial safety in the workplace, etc. You know, so there's these sorts of issues as well, I think. We've come to mentoring and research training opportunities. So, you know, thinking about what are the mentoring skills that you can actually offer a student outside of the traditional sort of, academic supervisory sorts of roles, and giving some sort of career advice. What we do find is that many PhD students graduate and they're in such high demand that they may go into senior roles like level C and not do a level A and B, which is sometimes some of the fundamental sorts of building blocks of an academic career. And so how do we build that into some of the work that we do in the supervisory roles? Is there aspects of your work that you might have capacity to put somebody on who's Indigenous as a research assistant? Because these are skills that are part of our, bread and butter of being an academic, and knowing how to do something like that outside of, your PhD, which is quite different to being an RA and a PhD. So how are we sort of thinking about what are those on-the-job skills so that, somebody is actually confident? Often as the first Indigenous person in a workplace or in a field, there's so much second guessing, and we know that there's imposter syndrome in HDR students generally, but as Indigenous students, it's doubly, because it's come through from sort of undergraduates where you're sitting there going, oh, well, you're only here because you're Indigenous. That is a big issue in terms of the mental weight that carries as well. So I think that's something to think about. What we did have was the National Indigenous Research and Knowledge Network, NIRICAN. That was a project that was funded by the ARC. We have now, it's now gone into its legacy phase. So that there is a website, which is nirican.edu.au, I believe. And there's a whole lot of resources on there around research methods, etc. And we've done a lot of this work with many of the Indigenous academic staff now in our institutions have come through NIRICAN. And it was led by a distinguished Professor Aileen Morton-Robinson and many of our senior Indigenous academics who are also, some are emeritus professors and emerita professors now, yet we haven't been able to keep that momentum going. And I think that was a really strong piece of work that I think would benefit not only Indigenous students, but also benefit all of our HDR students in Australia, particularly given our research priorities in how we should, and I don't say we are doing it, but we should be able to engage in Indigenous research contexts, I think is something that's important. Also creating inclusive academic environments. And this is speaking more broadly around the research infrastructure. So deans of research, graduate deans of research, what is it within your sort of spheres of influence that you can actually change in turn or influence at that sort of administrative phase that will help a student's journey in terms of engaging with little impact? So it could be scholarships that, things like that sit within the graduate school. Sometimes Indigenous scholarships all sit with the Indigenous Support Centre. And so how are these conversations being had across institutions as such? I've also got recognising having culturally safe spaces. This is also racially safe spaces. So this piece, I got culturally safe spaces because it's part of the research as one of the findings, but some further research we've also, with the Diversity Council, it's actually having workplaces that are racially safe for all race, in terms of how people are engaging in that sort of space, and holistic supports. And I think that there's some underlying guiding principles that upholds values of reciprocity, respect, equality, responsibility, survival, protection, spirit, and integrity in all interactions. We engage in an institution and the institutions in this country that has once been very extractive in terms of its relationship with Indigenous communities. And so sometimes there's a bit of trepidation in terms of how we're engaging. Also knowing that there are very stringent ethics processes. So I don't actually understand the entire need to engage with IATSIS when, for example, the IATSIS ethics committee, we actually have robust ethics committees within our institutions, yet sometimes when it comes to Indigenous stuff, you go, oh no, we need to go to IATSIS. That then knocks on a completion by probably 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, months. Why is it as soon as it says Indigenous, it's IATSIS? We have ethics committees that speak to NHMRC, that speak to, so we have these robust systems. And so I think that's part of that sort of governance and how are we actually then having those conversations. And it's not actually then saying we haven't got an Indigenous person on the ethics committee. The ethics committee should actually be skilled enough to make an informed decision on research. Then be able to contact the relevant person who might be a lay person, etc., around it. But we should have the faith within our systems that our ethical processes are robust, yeah. And so when for my sins, I sat on ethics committee for probably 10 years at a large institution. And sometimes, and my role was that my rule of thumb was, if I was reading this application, do I want these random people out and about in my communities running rife? And, so I sort of had that at the back of my head when I was sort of thinking about, and I did say that to my colleagues, would you actually let these people out and about, just randomly doing research? Like, yeah, no. Also, so why am I getting the application? Why is that? Do I need to have that hard conversation with you again? That because it says Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, you send it to the black face in the room. Okay, once again, so there's that sort of, really around sticking by what our processes are. Okay, some of the key takeaways for supervisors is, again, it comes back to what is good supervision. Active listening, being proactive and setting clear expectations, fostering agency in students, as we do with all students at different levels of their HDR candidature and their journey when they're ready, and scaffolding and stepping them through that. Get your university to start thinking about professional development, and they still want to use culturally responsive. Okay, that's fine. But how is it culturally responsive in relation to supervision, for example? How is it culturally responsible in relation to curriculum development? You know what I mean? You can't just sort of have a one-size-fits-all, I'm being flippant, but boomerangs and beanbags that doesn't speak to the actual need of what we're doing it for. You know what I mean? And so that creates a depth of knowledge. And also challenging the assumptions of our own disciplines where we actually sit as supervisors, where we're actually from. How do we create the spaces for Indigenous knowledges and our PhD students to engage in disciplines where once they were spoken about or researched, or, papers were written about them, how do we actually create those spaces that, Indigenous knowledges and perspectives can flourish at disciplines level that changes the canon of knowledge? So I'm almost right on time, Tracy. As I said, I've got my email there as well, and the link to our book. It was a very quick overview of the text and what's available. But what I tried to impart to you is that good supervision is good supervision sometimes, and we get caught up in the sort of stuff around it, and each student is quite different in terms of their needs or their research or how they want to engage. As I said, some students just want to come in, they're 1 day a week, they're going to do this work and leave. They might be part-time. Sometimes our students also come in who are mature age. They also say, look, I don't want to be teaching my supervisor how to be nice to me, or how to, you know, how to actually function in an Indigenous, you know, I've had students say, am I going to be a footnote on somebody's promotion application? And that was a very astute, you know, HDR student. I thought, okay, that's, yeah, you've picked that up. That's quite interesting. You know, and to be thinking about, I think, how are we fostering our Indigenous students into academic careers if they actually want that, and thinking about, you know, the PhD and the qualification is such a small part of the career, and that, you know, saying in creating those expectations within student, this is just a small part of what you're going to do. It doesn't all have to be into that PhD. You might want to, you know, start having another file where you're saying to-do list post-graduation. I'm a big advocate for postdocs in the sector to actually grow the academic skills. There's very few institutions that have postdocs for Indigenous students, as I said. We create a market where Indigenous students go straight into senior academic roles or academic roles that then are at the interface of teaching. For many of us who have been the level A or level B, you're just sort of getting hammered with teaching. But how do we actually create the 40-40-20 in a sustainable way where research training is really grounded as well? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hopefully it will. Hang on.
I just did it for you, Peter.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to have a look at the chat, and if there are any questions between Tracy and I, we will get to you, I'm hoping. Yes, slides I've PDF'd and sent the slides off already, and so they'll be sent on to everyone. Yeah. Thanks, Brett. That was a good comment. All things cultural safety.
Oh, we have a question in the chat from Rachel Spronken-Smith.
Yeah, look, I think it's actually around engaging with the student firstly and asking those questions and setting it up organically, and working out how the relationship will develop or what that could look like. Yeah. How do we manage cultural load? I hope I got to, sorry, I just saw that pick up, and I have a question around that. But going back to Rachel, your question, I really think it's actually about engaging with the student, open, transparent conversations around what the needs are in the beginning, and then possibly mapping that out. But I think it's case by case. I think managing cultural load as well is also, that is an individual conversation with each student. Sometimes it's a hard conversation to have with a student, because you have to actually say, you either do this or this. And we have those conversations with all of our students again. And it might be, with my students, I've had who are Indigenous, is mapping them all out and saying to them, well, do you want the PhD or not? What is it that's termed cultural load that you can actually do that's different? What is actually something, you know, one of the things that I come back to is my culture is not a load on me. It's actually something to be celebrated. And so I then think about, is this actually colonial load? Is this something that is being put on the student by the university or externals or through jobs? So if somebody's coming from work into a PhD, I actually say to them, just tell them you're studying. You have to get your PhD. You just do this and say, sorry, I'm busy. You know, and really supporting the student in those conversations, or sometimes working with them to have that tough conversation. But we also owe the student the reality that we have to actually give up some things when we do a PhD. It's not, you know, I wish I could say it's all rosy, but it's not. And sometimes we don't have real conversations with students. And I think, you know, and Indigenous students understand, you know, we have tough conversations all the time, you know, so.
We've got a question here from Fiona around any suggestions for how to attract eligible Indigenous HDR candidates?
Yeah, I think to actually is, you know, asking yourself, and I've recently done some mapping at a previous institution, and things like our students who are coming to us, there wasn't look, so when they jumped onto the landing page of the university, there wasn't actually anything that denoted that there was any Indigenous research happening at that university. So how do we promote an Indigenous research culture that actually would get somebody to engage? So if it's a discipline or faculty website, are we actually creating, you know, visibility of Indigenous research? Because as you know, you sometimes go to the main university website and type in an expert, or you'll just say, well, I'm in education, so I'll look at the Faculty of Education website, but there'll be nothing there that says that it's engaged in any sort of Indigenous research at all that may want to attract students to actually want to engage. So by seeing that, you actually understand then that the faculty or school is at least safe because you have people doing some of this work, I think. And that's the conversations, I think, that we have with our marketing and comms people who are often, you know, our websites are very highly sought after real estate in our institutions. So sometimes it's having those difficult conversations there, I think. But it's actually about visibility, that, you know, moving beyond the space of, you know, Indigenous research is off to the corner. It's really, you know, Indigenous research is everybody's business because it's in the science priorities, it's in our major grants, it's in our ethical processes. So how do we, you know, create that environment in our marketing to attract students? But then it's also, it's not so much attracting students, it's how do we keep them? And that sometimes is the hardest thing because people say, well, I need more Indigenous people to actually do it. Well, unfortunately, we haven't got more Indigenous people to actually do it. So we have to sort of start doing it collectively.
So, Peter, on that topic, can I ask, do you think that there's any advantage to trying to engage with undergraduates around the kinds of opportunities as a way also to attract more students to decide to continue with their research education?
I think so. There's now, Louise, this is a two-process kind of space because often our Indigenous undergraduate cohorts can't wait to get out. They've actually had a bad time. And I'm saying in my discipline of education, sometimes the allied health and law, where what I say is we're often relegated to the mad, the bad, and the sad, where we're spoken about. And so there's been a negative experience at that class, or that tutorial, the content, or the lecture side, that the last thing that they want to do is actually go on. So that, as I said, the trajectory is never linear as such from undergraduate through to postgraduate because of the negative experiences. So I think that's a conversation around the safe spaces through curriculum pedagogy that will then create these pipelines. But it could be the biggest untapped area, I think, is our mature age students who are out in industry, who are in government sort of spaces, and how do we get them back in? And actually, but to that cohort it's actually selling how we've changed and how we can actually work with them, I think, as well.
We have a question in the chat here, Peter, from Jane O'Leary, commenting on how wonderful the Neurokin site is, but also reflecting on Western concepts of academic criticism and feedback can be harsh and feel culturally unsafe for Indigenous students. However, not challenging them to accept these standards may set them up for failure. Wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Oh, look, it's my Jane, and I know Jane. Why can't we just be nicer in feedback? I've come back on, you know, and I'm editing a book, and one of the things I've actually said to all of the editors is that we actually need to be nicer in our feedback, in engaging with people. It's not about tearing down. I think it's part of the academic culture that, particularly for Indigenous students, it's almost like a personal attack. Where you're constantly saying you have not you have not read this, you've not done that. This is, you know, blah. One of my big things is feedback on journal articles, on any sort of work, is actually to do it with some humanity. That to really do it, that there's actually a person at the end of this that you're, you know, that you're writing this feedback to, and this could actually make or break. And this is generally in feedback, but it's also, you know, again, speaking to Indigenous students, this is a place where we lose them as well. So how do we actually scaffold those skills to be able to systematically be able to engage in feedback and how to respond to it, whether it's an Excel spreadsheet? What are the skills you need to actually respond to something, you know? Sometimes I've had students who, you know, feedback is that, you know, I don't know where people giving feedback get off on actually saying this research does not feel or read Indigenous enough. Like, that happens in feedback. I mean, you know, like all of these different things, or has this research got Indigenous experts in it? And also thinking that we're in processes of peer review. Peer review means often that you can't, it's de-identified, yet you're then asking a researcher or student to identify themselves as Indigenous. As I said, I could go on with feedback forever.
We have a question from Natalie Robertson in the chat around going about accompanying Indigenous students through trauma as they research impact of colonisation with communities fully conscious that our institutions are part of that legacy.
Yeah.
Based on personal experience.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, for your question. I think this is something that is around getting to know the student as well, and how we're working with the student through these processes, and really understanding what the needs are of the students, and working. It's really, you know, that insider outsider part of the research, and how we're balancing this and how we're navigating students through this. Unfortunately, we don't have a system where we can actually say, this is how we do it. Each student and each research, as you know, each community is different with different needs and different experiences. And so how we navigate that trauma is something that I think we need to have the conversations with our graduate deans of research, that perhaps this is an area that the enrollment time actually needs to stop, and that this gets resolved so the research can keep going. And so in that phase, the relationship building with an Indigenous research project is fundamentally relational. And so often our funding is a 4-year funding envelope. And so trying to squeeze everything into that one thing, it becomes a, you know, a systems issue. and that our communities know that this person hasn't engaged properly with us, because we would say, you know, I always say really good research, that's a 6-month process of relationship building before you even get on the ground to start doing some of that work. And so how do our structures actually recognise and speak to that is fundamentally, I think, the next frontier in terms of developing further success. But I haven't got a finite response or answer for you, but I think it's something that we need as an institution, as institutions, to really think about in terms of these structures that can, you know, hinder students, particularly time and dealing with communities. And if it's traumatic, having that sort of team around the student, they may be fine, but saying, here's some supports that may also be able to help you in navigating this as well, I think is important.
Kia ora.
We have another question here from Marie Martinussen around how administrative burdens can inordinately affect students from equity backgrounds and the ways it can be re-traumatizing. You mentioned having a dedicated support person, but do you have any more thoughts on that problem from a supervisor perspective?
Yeah, look, from a supervisor perspective, often our systems are set up by those who are not marginalised. So they don't actually speak to the challenges that marginalised peoples have. So I think for those of us who have, you know, administrative oversight, are there ways in which we can actually make these sorts of processes more conducive to Indigenous peoples, to those from diverse backgrounds, that actually makes this process much easier? And it then frees up a dedicated person to actually get into the weeds with a student. You know, I had one of my staff members who's like, why am I dealing with someone in the research graduate school about their drop-down menu when I've got 10 other students who have quite not complex needs, but, you know, we have students who need editing, or, you know, all of these different things that happen when a student's close to submission, that his time was chewed up by doing administrivia. So I think it's sort of trying to unpack some of those sorts of things as well, and really divvying out those different roles, that governance is an issue within research management as well.
Right, we've got 2 minutes left, so we might have room for one more quick question, if anyone has anything they'd like to ask Peter before we wrap up. Everyone's shy today and leaning on the chat. All right, well, we're about to hit time, so can I just say a sincere thanks, Peter, on behalf of ACGR, for an amazing session and such an insightful session. And also to say that we'll be working on our good practice guidelines at ACGR to integrate some of these insights, and also to unpack some of this work and think about what we can do to support you in the implementation of some of the ideas and perspectives that Peter's spoken about today. So thank you so much, Peter, and thank you everyone for being here. And there's a link to Nirakin in the chat. ACGR have provided a link to the book. You should also have a link to the book from Peter. And if you have any further questions, please reach out to Peter's obviously given his email, but you can also reach out to ACGR. So thank you very much. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for coming.
Have a great afternoon.